And today we have Dr. Hilary Mangus, who is going to talk to us about what itinerant teachers need to know about Indicator 13. And you will also be receiving an email that has handouts that will be available after this. Thank you. And Dr. Mangus, please take away.
Thanks, Erin. Good afternoon, and thank you everybody for having me with you this afternoon. I actually did this training last year with the teachers of the blind visual impairment, and I'm excited to get to also do it for the teachers of the deaf hard of hearing, because I think it's important for you to understand the secondary transition needs for students and your role as an itinerant teacher or sometimes case manager in providing services and supports that help students transition into independent living, employment, and or post-secondary education or training. I co-lead the Secondary Transition Initiative with my colleague, Jackie Lister, out of our Patton East office. And we are excited that everybody is enthusiastic to learn a little bit more about transition. So one of the things that we'll talk about the most today are those regulatory requirements for students with disabilities as we talk about secondary transition. One of the things that you'll start to see is as students' files are pulled for cyclical monitoring, there is a lot of overlap between the Indicator 13 requirements and things that are pulled in the cyclical monitoring file review. So we'll talk a little bit about that connection and the overlap between the monitoring and the file review. But first
Hilary,
I want,
sorry,
yes,
this is Erin for 1 second. Tom is working real quick to get our interpreter.
the captionist.
And the captionist, yep.
Okay,
You might want to switch to side-by-side gallery view, because if you don't just want speaker, there, if you switch to side-by-side, I'm going to turn my camera off.
I might have to escape out.
Yep, I have the, no, you're good. I'm just talking to the participant. Sorry, not you, Hilary. The participant who needs, and then the captioning. We need to get the captionist up, Tom.
Hi, Hilary. Are you able to make me the host rather than the co-host? I think that's the role I need to make the necessary changes. Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, is that making any difference for everyone? Are you able to see ASL and interpreting?
Yes, we have the interpreter. And so does our participants that need it. And we're just waiting for the captioning.
You need the captionist to be seen or captioning?
Captioning.
Okay, if the captionist could go ahead and do some typing, I think that should be on for everyone now.
There we go.
Okay.
All right, so sorry about that, everybody. Just to kind of reorient you, where we were talking about is what secondary transition is in general. And so we go to the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Act 2004, to get the definition. And really, the words in bold are what you kind of want to focus on, because as we talk through today, that idea of this coordinated set of activities, so that thought that the IEP is coordinated from the present levels through the transition grid into the measurable post-school goals, and that there's a results-oriented process in mind, and that what we're trying to do is move that student both academically and functionally to a way that can facilitate them from high school into their post-school activities, including all of the things that you see in the definition. So really the goal of the IEP at this point is for students to transition out of school into their adult lives. And so this, when you think about that primary purpose of IDEA, transition really is at the heart of the primary purpose of IDEA. So little side by side, in IDEA, transition begins at 16. However, in Pennsylvania, under Chapter 14 regulations, transition services must be addressed in the IEP during the year in which a student turns 14, but it also can be done earlier. So we don't have to wait until a student is 14 to consider their transition needs. And this is especially true now, given the Every Student Succeeds Act and the work with the Career Readiness Indicator. I would say if we're waiting till 14 to start having conversations about what a student wants to do when they leave, we actually are starting too late. We have data through ESSA and the Career Readiness Indicator that can give us information, let us know about a student's strengths and interests, preferences, careers that they've explored prior to 14. And so we really should be thinking about how can we incorporate that into the student's IEP, whether or not they have specific transition goals or not, but at least so that we have that understanding that this isn't the first time that this consideration has been made. So secondary transition is one of the 17 indicators in the state performance plan and the annual performance report that we have to report to OSEP. So you can see 13 is our transition goals. This is our transition compliance. Some of the other ones that relate to transition, especially indicator 14, the post-school outcomes, graduation and dropout, parent involvement, and the state systemic improvement plan. So we have a lot kind of focused around getting students into situations where they graduate beyond the couch and they're graduating to meaningful outcomes. And they really all kind of align together to make sure that we're working that way. But again, today, for today's purpose, we're really talking about what does compliance look like from a transition standpoint. So I talked a little bit about that connections of the different parts of the state performance plan and the annual performance report. But at the foundation of all of it is that all students should have access to high quality, rigorous, standards aligned secondary programs. And that's all students, and that they're designed with the appropriate supports and accommodations to ensure the least restrictive environment. From there, we are designing high quality IEPs that help students achieve their post-secondary goals. And when we see that, that's indicator 13. But when we see high quality IEPs and high quality access to standards aligned instruction, students are more engaged in their education and they're more likely to stay in school and graduate. So that tie into indicators 1 and 2. And so as students stay in school longer, have meaningful IEPs and high quality instruction, they're more likely to achieve their rigorous post-school goals. And that's the way the things connect in that state performance plan annual performance report. So I mentioned that we pour indicator 13 data from the cyclical monitoring file review that happens for LEAs on a cyclical process. So during the monitoring, 10 files are selected. There are expectations in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh because they have more students. During this, the way the file is reviewed is the IEP, the evaluation report or the reevaluation report, invitations, and any supporting documents, communication plans, behavior support plans, etc. Of those 10, at least 3 of the files must be students aged 16 to 21, and 1 student must be between the ages of 14 and 15. In addition, they will pull at least 1 student from an approved private school. There are 340 questions on the file review. Of that, there are specific questions that are directly related to transition that were added in 2015. And so then there became an actual more specific targeted focus where 10 additional files are pulled now for students aged 14 and above, and 10 questions related to transition were added to the file review. So you can see that during the monitoring, at a minimum, 14 students of transition age files are being reviewed. So transition happens through a process, and in that process, the best way to think about it is that it doesn't end while a student's in school. This process is ongoing, and that's why we have the arrow that continues in the circle. At the core foundation of it is that assessment has to happen, and good, meaningful assessment. We use that assessment to drive our present levels and our goal writing. And we also use that information to see what students want to do, what strengths and interests they have, and how does that relate to their plans after school. We have to then put meaningful services and activities in place to help the student achieve with the most high likelihood those post-school goals. And so we'll talk a little bit about what the goals look like, the difference between the measurable post-school goals and the measurable annual goals. But at the heart of it, what you need to know is that these post-school goals are written to occur after a student leaves. So things like Hillary has a goal to attend college, whereas our measurable annual goals are those goals that are the things that we're working on during the 1-year duration of the IEP. And those things should all be aligned, meaning that I shouldn't be writing a measurable annual goal that doesn't have impact on something I want to do when I leave. And that's where the work of itinerant teachers really becomes important, because how are you writing goals, measurable annual goals, that are going to help that student with their plans after they leave school? And what services and activities are you doing to help move them in that direction? So the first step in the process is assessment, and assessment shouldn't be a one and done. And there are different types of assessments. There are specific assessments that you'll give as a teacher of the deaf, hard of hearing. There are transition specific assessments, and there are assessments that are given to measure academic and functional performance as well. There are specific questions in the cyclical monitoring. So the way these slides will work is on the left, you'll see the file review questions. And one of the handouts that you will be receiving is our Indicator 13 file review. This is what we use during our trainings with LEAs when they're going to be monitored for Indicator 13. So we try to help them to make the connection between the file review and the Indicator 13 process. And we use IEPs to do this. So this is a good tool that you can use to spot check your own IEPs to make sure that you're hitting all of the transition requirements. So the slides kind of mirror what's on that Indicator 13 checklist. But at the crux of it is there evidence that the measurable post-school goals were based on age-appropriate transition assessments? And those assessments, again, can be many different types of things. So I mentioned interest, preference, skills, and aptitude, academic achievement, functional performance, and then things specific to a disability. Those are all compiled together to write those present levels of academic and functional performance, as well as drive the writing of those post-school goals. Transition assessment specifically is designed to help the team formulate those post-secondary goals in the areas of employment, independent living, and post-secondary education and training. And so we should be able to use those assessments both specific to transition and specific to the other domains to talk about what impact do the things we know about this student, both positive, right, strengths-based, and based on their needs and accommodations and the things that they need to be successful. What do we know about that student, and how likely is that student to need different supports and services to help achieve their post-secondary goal? One of the things that I think is the most difficult is that no matter how you achieve the assessment data, it's meaningless unless it's interpreted. And that's sort of like a QR code. Anyone who sees a QR code knows that it's a QR code, but you don't know what it takes you to until you're able to make meaningful use of it and maybe use your camera to open the QR code. Data is the same way. We can dump data into IEPs, but unless we make the connections between the data and use that data to make a picture about that student, so the QR code is the picture of the student, we have to make that picture meaningful and include all of that data in a way that the people writing the goals in the IEP can make sure that the student is moving towards their post-secondary goals. So once we begin to interpret the assessment, that's when we're starting to write those present ed levels. Present education levels are meaningless unless there's good assessment and baseline data that drives the writing of it. And I think about the present ed levels like the beginning chapters of a book that tell us really where is that student currently functioning academically, behaviorally, social emotionally. What do we know about that student, and what do we know about their wants? And that's where we start, right? The present levels is like chapter 1 in a book. So we take all of that information that we're collecting, right? The academic information, the functional information, all of the skills that are related to their post-secondary transition, parent input, related service provider input, and we're funneling that into how does the student's disability impact their involvement in the general education curriculum, and what do we know then are their strengths and needs. As we move into step 3, we start writing measurable post-secondary goals. So these are the goals, right, that are the plans that the student has when they leave high school. These are the questions on the Indicator 13 checklist that relate to it, but most importantly, is there evidence that the student was even invited to their IEP meeting? So beginning at age 14, the student becomes required to be invited to the IEP. And one of the biggest mistakes that happen in a monitoring is that there isn't documentation that the student was invited. And if the student was there, their input isn't included into the IEP, or their name isn't signed or even included on the sign-in sheet. So really simple things to not get in trouble for, but it's one of the most common errors on the monitoring is the lack of evidence that the student was invited. I know that there used to be a requirement that there were 2 invitations printed and sent, one to the parent and one to the student. That's not the case anymore, and it's an LEA by LEA decision, but now we'll actually look at the IEP invitation, and I'll show you what things need to be documented in order to get through compliance. Because there's only one, that invitation must reflect that both the parent or parents and the students are invited for students of transition age. So here is the IEP invitation. So you can see here that where I'm kind of circling with my cursor, that the name and address of the parent or guardian goes there. Again, only one invitation is required. So typically this would just be the contact information for the parent or guardian. It is an LEA by LEA choice if they also want to include a second invitation for a student here. But where this becomes critical and what the monitors are looking for is if transition is being discussed, transition planning when a student is 14 or older, is this box checked? Oh, and then I'm sorry, transition services would be checked if an agency is being invited and you're likely to have them provide or pay for a service. But where they're going to look specifically first is where this box says child with a star here, and is the child's name there. That's the evidence that they're looking for. Some monitors are going to be a little bit more accommodating if that's not there for some reason, and they may look at the IEP sign-in sheet and give you a pass. But technically where they're looking and where they need to be seeing that information is here. So the best bet is to make sure that you have the student's name when they're 14 and older here, or if transition's being discussed earlier, that the student's name is here, and that they've also signed the IEP sign-in sheet as well. And so the next part of this too with the IEP invitation is whether or not an agency has been invited. So the big thing that you need to think about is that there has to be parent consent, and that agency must be discussed on the invitation. So what does that look like, and how do you know when to invite a student, when to invite an agency to an IEP for a student? So good rule of thumb is you're going to invite an agency if they're likely to provide or pay for transition services, and only with parent permission. So what does parent permission mean? In this instance, parent permission is considered achieved when you have included the name of the agency on the invitation, and we'll show where that will be, and the parent has signed and returned the invitation saying that they're coming. That is considered parent permission. What I'll tell you is best practice, and think about this as yourself as a parent. Would you want to attend a meeting where, and I get probably 400 papers a week, I swear, from my kids' school. So I don't always fine tooth comb them. I sometimes skim read. But I would be put off a little bit if I attended a meeting and there was someone there that I didn't understand why they were there. So a really good practice is, if you're inviting an agency, reach out to that parent, give them a phone call, send them an email, explain what agency you're inviting and why. Yes, technically compliance is the invitation, but think about your own perspective as a parent or as a teacher or anywhere you go. Would you want to walk into a doctor's office and have a random person treating you that you didn't know? Or a random person talking about you that you didn't know? So think about that, and just remember, kind of best practices to do that. Reach out to the family and say, hey, Hillary's turning transition age. This is when OVR typically becomes involved. We'd really like to invite them to the meeting with your permission. And I'm going to include that on the invitation. If you have any questions, here's a brochure. Here's information about OVR that I can share with you. Now, that leads to a second part of it. Just because we invite them doesn't mean that they always attend. Think about your caseloads as itinerant teachers. The state mandated caseload for itinerant is high, 1 to, right, in some instances, depending on the position, it can be 65. In OVR, the OVR caseload can be 1 to 500. So if we think scheduling IEPs for our 65 itinerant students is difficult, just imagine how hard it would be to attend an IEP meeting for 500 students. So that's where good communication with families and sharing information and documenting things in the IEP really becomes important. Agency involvement is based on individual needs. So OVR is more likely to prioritize and attend a meeting for a student who is older and getting ready to exit. But they may either provide information or participate briefly via phone or by Zoom or Google Meets now. For a student who's younger if they have more intense needs. So again, for a younger student, it might be less involvement from the outside agencies. It may also vary by region to region. And there are also agencies besides OVR that can be involved with a student. So supports coordinators, mental health service providers, advocates for a family. That being said, all of this information should be documented in the present levels. And a good rule of thumb is to bullet it as agency involvement and talk about their input and what was discussed specific to the agency in the IEP. So what does this look like on the invitation? I mentioned checking the box transition services. That box gets checked when an agency is being invited that's likely to provide or pay for services. And then there is a spot on the IEP team members where you would document the name of the agency. It may not always be a name that you know, so you could say OVR designee or agency supports coordinator designee. That sometimes in those positions there's a lot of turnover, so it might not consistently always be the same person. But that is where, from a compliance standpoint, they're looking. So they're looking for that box to be checked, transition services, and then at least one agency, if that box is checked, to be identified under the role. They're also looking on the IEP sign-in sheet to see if that person attended. If they didn't attend, then they're looking in the present levels to see, was there any documentation about what information was provided to the family and to the student about that agency if they were not able to attend. So some good rules of thumb. Again, if it isn't documented in the IEP, it didn't happen. So it's really important to document that information as agency involvement in the present levels. We talked about bulleting as its separate point, and just like we highlight the specific transition goals, right? So we discuss all things related to post-secondary education and training, so the assessments, the goals, the data that we have. We do that for employment, and we do it for independent living. We also want to then do this for agency involvement. So this would be if they're in attendance, who attended and what information was discussed. If they didn't attend, what information was shared with the family, a phone number. IEP meetings are intense, and sometimes the best place that the parent can find the information is if it's documented in the IEP. So documenting either the email, the phone number and address of the agency that you're sharing with them so that they can come back to that IEP document and have that information. So again, just talking a little bit about documentation. Attendance can include participation by telephone or video conference. As an IEP team, you may list the names of those individuals who participate by telephone or video conference in the printed name column on the IEP sign-in sheet and how they participated. If an agency has sufficient notification about the IEP meeting, but they can't attend, they can also give you written input. And that should also be included in the present levels under secondary transition. Again, sometimes not only do our agency partners have really high caseloads, we don't always notify them in a timely manner about the meeting date and time. And so not only do they have maybe 500 students that they're working with or 500 cases that they're working with, but we let them know 3 days before the meeting about the meeting. So also just being mindful that giving timely notice increases the likelihood that an agency might participate in person or provide information to you for the meeting. Some sample statements. So things like representatives from agencies were invited with parent permission, or the parent refused to give consent to invite the outside agency personnel. Or although a specific agency was invited, they were unable to attend the meeting. Therefore, the parent and the student were provided information about OVR, about the Office of Intellectual Disabilities, about behavioral health services, whatever it is, being a little bit more specific. But these are kind of good sentence stems to get you started when talking about agency involvement. I mentioned that there are more agencies than OVR. It could be county mental health, developmental programs. I mean, this is not even an exhaustive list of all the different services and agencies that could be supporting a student. And sometimes the best person to ask is the parent. Does your child have a supports coordinator? Is your student receiving any outside mental health services? Can we invite them to the meeting? We'd really like to all be on the same page because sometimes the parents are so overwhelmed that they don't think, oh, I should have told them that I had a supports coordinator in that plan. Or my student has an open case with OVR, but I've never mentioned that to the school. Having all of those people at the table really increase the likelihood of good, meaningful outcomes for students. And so making sure that we ask those questions of families and we get their permission to invite the people that are working with their children to the table. Another important part related to transition are for students who attend the Career Tech Ed Centers. So something that's often overlooked if a student attends a Career Tech Ed Center is the CIP code completed on the IEP. Very simple thing, but as we start into Section 3, Transition Services, you see here this box for students in Career Tech Ed Center CIP code. Sometimes that's neglected to be entered. You can find the CIP codes on the VOTEC or the CTE school. They have all of their programs listed by their CIP codes when you search. So making sure that if a student is attending that school, that we make sure that that code is included in this box. So this really gets into the meat of the IEP as it relates to transition, the grid itself. And so this is where what we think of technically as the transition plan, when in actuality, the whole IEP is the transition plan. So we look specifically for, are there goals in the areas of education and training, employment, and independent living? And we'll talk about the fact that data can show that you may or may not need a goal in one or more areas, and what to do in that instance. And then the other part of it is, are those goals updated annually? That doesn't mean that my goal, right? If I have a goal to attend college, my goal might be always to attend college. But am I supporting that goal with data every year that talks about how I've moved closer to that, or what things I've done to help increase that likelihood of going to college? So when we talk about updating the goals annually, that doesn't mean that those post-school goals have to change. They might stay the same, but there has to be something in the present levels that talks about why it stayed the same or why it changed if it changes. So what do I put in the grid, right? We are including those goals in the 3 areas. So goals for education, employment, and independent living. This is also where we are including the course of study that a student is taking. An area where people sometimes get into trouble is that they don't update this. So an IEP runs for 1 year minus 1 day from the meeting. If you have your IEP in January when you're in 9th grade, we don't update that IEP till January in 10th grade, but our courses of study need to be updated to match the courses that we're taking in 10th grade. So there's a couple ways that you can get around that. One is that you can do the current year course of studies and then a projected course of studies, or you can do a revision to the IEP at the beginning of the year to make sure that those courses of study reflect the actual grade in the courses that that student is taking. Because if my IEP is in January and then it's September and my file is pulled in the monitoring, but my courses still say my 9th grade courses and I'm now in 10th grade, if they've not been updated, that's a thing on the monitoring that can get checked as not compliant because my courses of study don't match with the grade that I'm in. Some of the other things that are in there are those services. So the services are the IEP goals, the things that I'm working on, my communication plan, my access to an interpreter, the need for closed caption. Those are all services that are helping me relate to and achieve my post-secondary goals. And then activities are things that I do to explore, experience, and learn about different post-secondary options. And we'll talk about that difference on the next few slides. Let's first talk about what measurable post-secondary goals are. Again, we're reviewing that assessment data to create the goals, and we're looking at how that data informs us about the 3 areas. So how does the assessment data I have inform what I want to do in terms of post-secondary education or training? How does it relate to employment? And then how does it relate to independent living? One of the things I'll say is that people often think of independent living specifically for students with more significant cognitive disabilities, but I would challenge you to think outside the box about that because especially across different disabilities, what things might that student need to be successful living by themselves if that's their goal? Just because they maybe are a strong student or they participate in organizations doesn't mean that they have all the skills they need to be successful living independently. If they don't know how to access medical services or keep appointments or take medication, what skills can we build now while they're in high school to help them be more successful living independently? If they don't know how to request the accommodations that they need, that also has an impact on their ability to live independently. So we want to think about all of the whole picture of the student, not just those students with maybe more significant disabilities and specifically cognitive disabilities, but go broader than that and think about the impact on independent living. So this is what the grid looks like in the IEP. The first place that we would be writing is that post-secondary goal. So the goal is either going to say something about student has a goal to attend some type of post-secondary education, or they may not have a goal in that area because they might be going right to employment. So those are kind of two types of statements, but we never leave the grid blank. We never, if they don't have a goal, we don't leave it blank. We actually have to write in, Hillary is going right to employment and therefore does not have a post-secondary education goal. Some of the best practice evidence that you'll want to look for is on this slide. Does the present level section of the IEP have evidence that all 3 goal areas have been considered? Is there a goal or a statement that the goal has been addressed by the IEP team in the 3 areas? Are the goals written to occur after the student has graduated from high school? Is there evidence that they've been updated annually? And is there a summary of how the student has made progress toward previous goals? So either the goal is remaining the same based on updated assessments, or that goal has changed from year to year. A good example of that might be a student who attends a CTE in 9th or 10th grade, decides after that first year that, you know what, this isn't really for me. I don't want to attend the CTE and I'm not really interested in vet tech anymore. So that goal might change. But that goal should change because we'll have data in the present levels and then we'll have the grid updated to reflect that change as well. I can say I don't think many of us knew what we wanted to do when we were 14. And so it's okay for those goals to change. It's also okay for them to stay the same if that's what the data suggests. Courses of study, I mentioned this on the overview slide. These are those things that the student is currently taking. And it's really important that these courses of study are things that will reasonably enable a student to meet his or her post-secondary goals. So if a student is interested in becoming a vet tech, are they attending the CTE if there's a vet tech program? Or are they taking rigorous science courses that would allow them to be successful in a vet tech program? So again, those courses that they're taking, do they reasonably allow a student to meet those post-secondary goals? And those courses of study should align directly with that LEA's program of studies. There shouldn't be anything written as a course of study that isn't in the LEA's program of studies through their guidance program. So some of the things that we see is like life skills science, but that life skills science class isn't written into the program of studies. It might be called general science. Make sure that the program of studies matches what you have in the course of studies and that it's rigorous and allows that student to move toward their post-secondary goals. Again, course of studies are part of those activities that we're doing to help the student. The things that they're taking, the courses that they're taking should be meaningful in allowing them to move appropriately, both academically and functionally. We also are looking for, is the student going to be able to access graduation by meeting the graduation requirements? Are they aligned to their post-secondary goals? Do they include programs of study if they're attending a CTE program? Again, we're not calling them functional or college prep classes. We're actually calling them what is in the program of studies. And again, we mentioned earlier, the course of study must reflect that student's current year's courses. So where the red arrow is where you put the course of studies. A good way around it, remember, is to put current year and projected course of study for the following year, or you just need to do a revision to the IEP at the start of the school year to update the course of study. So here's an example with information filled out in terms of a sample goal and course of study. You can see that the courses are named specifically to what would be found in a program of study. So another thing that's looked at in the monitoring is the presence of services in the IEP that would enable the student to meet his or her post-secondary goals. So what does that mean? And then are there annual IEP goals related to that student's transition needs? So I mentioned that the services are things that are related to the measurable annual goals. So the way that we recommend that you document this, so you can see here, this student has a math goal, obviously. So we've denoted it in the IEP as a service, improving skills in solving algebraic equations and inequalities, and increase writing fluency and willingness to write. We didn't rewrite the measurable annual goals. We just alluded to what are the skills that are being worked on in the measurable annual goals. And then secondary would be activities, so things that they're doing. So that student is using a word processor and a graphic organizer to help with the completion of assignments. So that's an activity to help them with that goal. And she needs to be able to use those things to be able to write to meaningfully attend college, right? So her post-secondary goal was to attend a college or university. And then you can see, again, just the arrow has moved to the specific activity. One of the other things that I'll highlight is when you have a goal here, is there a measurable annual goal that aligns to it? So see here the line underline, it's underlined yes. If you have a transition goal, there should be at least one measurable annual goal that aligns to the measurable or to the post-secondary goal. So we want to make sure that that is also checked yes on our IEPs as well when we have post-secondary goals there. So what are services and activities? They're just the things that we're doing to help the student move toward their post-secondary goals. And they should also, just like specially designed instruction related services, those should also be and modifications. Those should also be occurring during the current IEP year. Again, every post-secondary goal should have at least one service tied to a measurable annual goal and at least one activity. But there may be more than one, and that's okay as well. But at a minimum, it's one service and one activity. And they should be coordinated, right? I shouldn't have things that don't make sense to my goal. So a good example of this is I reviewed an IEP, and the student had a goal to work in a child care center to get their associate's degree in a child care center. But they were a student in the life skills program who was attending the Career Tech Ed Center for Cosmetology. I have a PhD and I don't think I could pass the cosmetology boards. So it didn't make a whole lot of sense to see that the student was attending the CTE for cosmetology that didn't align with what her post-school goal was, right? And so doing a little investigating, that CTE actually had a program that was the equivalent of earning an associate's degree in early childhood. That student would have had better activities and services in her IEP had she been attending the CTE for the thing that she wanted to do, the job she wanted to have. So you can see where alignment really does matter. These things have to be listed in the grid. These are just some do's and don'ts that will help you as you go through. Again, you do not need to word for word state the measurable annual goal, but what need is being addressed. So communication, hearing, reading, writing, and then what's being done too. We want to make sure that things that are being done in the general education setting that relate to that goal are also being talked about. So these next couple slides, one will give you sample services. So services are those things that address deficits related to the measurable annual goal and can be progress monitored. Whereas activities are things that the student does. So for example, in the area of post-secondary education and training, a college fair or a college visit would be an example of an activity. And so the next couple slides will go through the 3 goal areas and list specific examples that you can consider for students as you're writing or working on their IEPs. So again, examples for employment, job shadowing, creating a career portfolio, etc. And then examples for independent living, working on budgeting skills, food prep, checking the listings for apartments and working on budgeting for an apartment. Those would all be things that are examples of activities that you could list for independent living. Another area that people sometimes miss is just filling out the location, frequency, beginning and ending date, and the person or agency responsible. So just like when we're writing a goal and we have to say how often, when, and who, we have to say that for the transition plan as well. So where is it happening, how often, when is it starting and ending, and who are the persons or people responsible. Just making sure that that information is accurately and completed in the grid. And here's one of the things I'll say. There are times when we don't get to something, we don't obtain a goal in an IEP. Just the same as when a goal isn't met, we reflect upon that in the present levels. If for some reason we have activities or things that we say the student is going to do, but they don't do within the year, we need to talk about that in the present levels and talk about why. Why didn't the student obtain their driver's license? Okay, if they didn't obtain it, what help might they need during this plan period to address that need? And then we really need to think about writing the measurable annual goals that help address those skill deficits and lead to the post-secondary goals. So we want to make sure that the MAGs, the measurable annual goals, build skills that the student needs to work on, and that we begin from a baseline, and that they're measurable and countable, and that they're written to include the ability to monitor progress. So this is just a good example of a tool that will help you write your measurable annual goals. This will be provided to you as a handout, so you can use this if you're not sure if you're completing your goals correctly, but it really just takes you through the questions and the steps that you must answer when writing the measurable annual goal. This also will be provided to you as a handout. So this is a really nice tool because it takes the parts of the measurable annual goal and breaks it out. So condition, name. I can't speak highly enough about making sure that you put the right student's name in the IEP. It's really easy to copy and paste templates, but please make sure you use the right name and the preferred gender pronouns in their IEP. Making sure that you clearly define the behavior. That we talk about the performance criteria, so how well, how consistently, and how often the student will be working on those goals. And then at the end of all of it, we have to measure and monitor progress and adjust the IEP as needed, just the same as we would for the goals that we write for our students. And then that process really begins again. That circular process really does begin again. With progress monitoring, I'll say it's nearly impossible to monitor a goal if it's not written clearly and it's not written in a measurable term. In order to write goals that are clear and measurable, we need to have baseline data, and our present levels need to be good. So again, we have to start with that really strong assessment, and we have to write and interpret really good present levels to help with that process. So that was kind of like the speed dating version of an Indicator 13 training that we do, where we go more in depth on each of those areas. But I did want to share with you some resources. They will be hyperlinks in the PowerPoint, but our patent transition site has a lot of information on it. Secondarytransition.org, which is being updated, is a great, that's the PA Secondary Transition Guide, has a lot of information to help. And then the National Technical Center, Assistance Center on Transition. So I will stop sharing this screen and I will go out into just to show you all of the information. So they are currently going through a reauthorization, but there's all kinds of training information. If you want to learn more about transition, this is your mecca. But in addition, on our patent site, I just wanted to highlight some of the things that can help you. So if you go to secondary transition, you can dig a little bit deeper about transition by following and looking at any of our archive trainings. including the ones under the Pennsylvania Community on Transition. But I'll also highlight that we do a conference annually this year, and last year it was virtual. It'll be virtual again this year. It is free to attend. It will be in August, and I would really strongly encourage that if you want to learn more about transition, that you consider participating in our virtual conference this year, because you'll get a lot of information. The other thing I'll say is that if you're working within an LEA and they're being trained in Indicator 13, make sure that you reach out to the special education advisor and say, hey, when you get through Indicator 13 training, I'd really like to be a part of it so that you can get more in depth. This is just kind of like the soup and nuts kind of overview for you, but there's definitely a lot more detail that's provided in our longer trainings. So I'm going to stop talking and ask Erin if there are any questions.
Thank you, Hillary. That was wonderful. You made a huge topic, quite understandable, and really hit some great highlights. You have answered all the questions that had come in thus far. If anyone else has a question, feel free to either unmute yourself or put it in the chat. We had questions about some examples of goals, and you had covered that as well. So if there is any other questions, this now is your time. We do have about 2 or 3 more minutes. If you have something specific for Hillary, feel free to unmute or type in the chat. They're liking your resources, and they like the clarity of how you presented. And I do have to echo, it was very clear and very well done.
It's a really big topic. I felt like it wasn't fair to give you like 1 hour of what is typically a multi-hour training for our LEAs that go through. The training in August is our secondary transition conference, the PA Community on Transition Conference. You can find information as it becomes available on the Patent site simply by clicking on PA Community on Transition and the 2021 conference. We're actually accepting proposals now. So if you're doing something really innovative with your students that you teach, or if you're writing goals in a really cool way that helps with obtaining post-secondary training, we would love to have you submit for the conference. You can get the information about the dates for the conference there. But in addition, once we have registration and everything, you'll be able to access that. You can also access previous training conference recordings. And if you're interested in kind of taking deeper dive, there's some really great trainings on this Pennsylvania Community on Transition. This is a cross-agency group that we do with OVR, with the Office of Developmental Programs, OMSAUS, where we do cross-agency training on topics specific to transition. So we've done things on person-driven planning, transition assessment, the life course tools. So you can kind of dig back through some of that. And then there are just some other things on here that I would highlight, like how to engage families in transition, and then the legislation impacting secondary transition. That's a really nice training because it highlights how different pieces of legislation that impact education, but as well as our agency partners, really call on people to work together to provide transition services. There's also some trainings that are going to be coming up starting in April and May that will be joint trainings between education and OVR. We just signed a new memorandum of understanding with OVR, and as part of that, and Erin's been doing some of this work with us as well, we are developing a whole bunch of new tools and resources to help increase and improve agency participation and collaboration in the IEP process. So this has been put together relatively quickly, so the training announcement should be going out. So I'm sure Erin would love to forward that to you. I think it should be going out in the next day or two. But
and
that
those webinars are in April.
Yeah, April, and there's one in May.
Yeah, perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Hillary. We're so thankful to have you here. It is great to always hear from you. And once again, yes, please make sure you look at that Community of Practice Transition virtual conference. It's definitely worth attending. I put into the chat already the link for the evaluation, and the code for today is HE03. That's HE03. So if you check There's the link to the evaluation is always in there, and the code is HE03. Any other questions or any other comments you'd like to have or make today? Thank you to our captioner and our interpreter. We are really thankful that you are here and that you give access to all of our attendees. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day. And be sure to come back to our last hour with the expert. That is next month. So thank you very much and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everybody.